That's what the fifth realtor told him, the same polite fiction they'd all used. Thomas, a black veteran with a chest full of medals and enough cash to buy the whole plot, stood on the manicured lawn he was told he could never own. But this small town made one fatal mistake. They didn't just refuse the man. They refused his money. And in America, money is the one language everyone ultimately understands. His name was Thomas Carter, a decorated Army major who served 3 tours, only to return home and face a battle no training could prepare him for, finding a place in the country he defended. Every no from every smiling realtor in the sleepy town of Oak Bend was a silent referendum on his place in it. But Thomas possessed 2 things they never accounted for: a substantial military pension and a brilliant, tactical mind. And as he stood there being told for the final time that his kind weren't welcome, a plan began to form. Not a protest, but an acquisition. Oak Bend, population 4,200, was the picture of American pastoral. White picket fences, a charming main street, and a singular, unspoken rule everyone understood. It stayed the way it was. Thomas Carter had chosen it precisely for that peace. After 22 years of global deployments, the quiet was the point. He'd sold his condo, pooled his pension and shrewd stock investments, and arrived with a clear dream. A few acres with a creek, a workshop for his woodworking, a quiet place to finally stand still. His first visit to Oak Bend Realty seemed promising. Betty Carlisle, the broker who'd sold half the town, was all smiles reviewing his impeccable financials. A 7-figure portfolio, no debt, cash ready. What a wonderful story, a veteran coming home, she'd chirped. She showed him 3 listings. The first, a gorgeous 10-acre parcel with a barn, was perfect. Thomas put in a full-price offer that afternoon. The call came the next morning. "So sorry, Thomas, the sellers. They just accepted another offer. A local family. It happened so fast." Undeterred, he tried with Linda at Homestead Properties. The second property, a fixer-upper on 5 acres, needed work which Thomas loved. His offer was strong, over asking to secure it. The response was a rehearsed sigh. "Oh darn, the zoning review came back. Can't subdivide that lot, and with your plans for a workshop the board would never. It's just not zoned for that kind of activity." There was no record of such a zoning review on file at the county office. He checked. The third realtor, a man named Dave, was more direct after seeing Thomas pull up. He looked at the file, then at Thomas, and closed it. "You know, I've got nothing that really fits your profile. Maybe try over in Milford, more diversity there." That was the first time the mask slipped. Profile asterisk, diversity. The coded language was a bullet he'd learned to dodge in boardrooms, but not here, not for a home. The fourth rejection came via text. The fifth was the one on the lawn, the zoning fiction. Each no was a strategic retreat in a war he hadn't declared. They weren't just rejecting an offer, they were enforcing a boundary. Thomas sat in his rental car, the silence heavy. He thought of the GI Bill his father was denied, the red-lined maps that carved cities into for us and not for us. He'd worn the uniform to break those very barriers, only to find them waiting for him, prettied up with petunias and picket fences. But Thomas Carter was not a man who retreated, he was a strategist. In the military, you learned that when a direct assault fails, you find leverage. You study supply lines. You identify the center of gravity. In Oak Bend, the supply line was money. The center of gravity was debt. He began to research, not as a homebuyer but as an intelligence officer. He pulled every public record on property transactions in the county. He analyzed business licenses, tax liens, and foreclosure filings. A pattern emerged, and it all led to one institution, the Oak Bend Regional Bank and Trust. Its logo was on the signage of every major realty office. Its managers sat on the town council. And according to municipal records, it held the primary mortgages for over 60% of the homes in the town limits, including, he cross-referenced, the properties of every realtor who had turned him down. The bank was the silent partner in every deal, the approving authority on every loan. It was the economic heartbeat of the town. And then he found his opening. Buried in a state financial regulatory filing was a brief, troubling note. Oak Bend Regional had been operating with perilously thin capital reserves for 3 consecutive quarters. A single bad loan season could trigger a regulatory review. They were vulnerable. Thomas quietly reached out to a discreet financial advisor in the city. He instructed him to begin acquiring shares in the bank's holding company, a small, publicly traded entity. He used shell corporations, spreading the purchases to avoid attention. The stock was cheap, stagnant. No one was buying because no one believed a sleepy, single-branch bank in a town like Oak Bend was a target. They were wrong. Weeks later, Thomas walked into the Oak Bend Regional Bank not as a supplicant, but as a shareholder. He requested a meeting with the bank president, Gerald Pratt. Pratt, a man with a grandfatherly demeanor that masked a steel-trap mind, received him in a wood-paneled office smelling of lemon polish and old money. "Mr. Carter, what can we do for you? Finally found a property?" Pratt asked, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Not quite, Gerald," Thomas said, taking a seat without being asked. He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk. It was a summary of his share acquisitions. "I've been studying your institution. You have a liquidity problem. Your commercial real estate portfolio is over-leveraged, and you're one economic hiccup away from the FDIC knocking on that beautiful oak door." Pratt's smile vanished. "I don't see what business that is of yours." "It becomes my business," Thomas said calmly, "when I own a controlling interest, which, as of this morning, I do." He let the words hang in the perfectly still, antiseptic air. The color drained from Gerald Pratt's face. He fumbled for his phone, his hand trembling. The world of quiet rejections and polite lies had just ended. The takeover had begun. The regulatory filing hit the state database at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday. A simple, dry notice of a change in controlling interest for Oak Bend Regional Bank and Trust. In financial circles, it was a non-event. In Oak Bend, it was an earthquake. Gerald Pratt spent a frantic 24 hours on the phone with regulators, lawyers, and his own stunned board, trying to find a legal block, a technicality, anything to stop it. There was nothing. Thomas Carter had done everything by the book. The battle for the bank was over before the town even knew it had begun. Thomas didn't fire Pratt. Not immediately. He installed himself as the new chairman of the board and called an all-hands meeting in the bank's small lobby. The staff, 15 people who knew every customer's middle name and grandchildren, stood nervously. Pratt stood to the side, looking hollowed out. Thomas faced them, not in a suit, but in his familiar field jacket. "My name is Thomas Carter. Some of you may have heard of me. As of yesterday, I am the controlling shareholder of this bank," he began, his voice calm, carrying. "I have no intention of disrupting your jobs or the services you provide to this community, but there will be changes, starting with a full, independent audit of every loan originated in the past 10 years. A low murmur went through the room. Audits were expensive, time-consuming. They implied something was wrong. Thomas continued. "This institution will return to its original charter principles, serving all *qualified members of the community with fairness. Any employee who cannot abide by that standard should resign today." No one moved. The silence was absolute. The power shift was complete, bloodless, and terrifying in its efficiency. The first ripple of panic hit the realtor's offices. Betty Carlisle was reviewing a listing when her assistant rushed in, face pale. "Betty, have you seen this? About the bank." Betty read the brief local news article, her blood running cold. "Local veteran acquires controlling stake." She recognized the name. Thomas Carter, the man with the full-price offer. The one she'd told about, the local family that beat him. A sickening realization dawned. She pulled her own mortgage file from the cabinet. The lender, Oak Bend Regional Bank and Trust. Her hands shook. She called Dave, the realtor who'd mentioned Milford. "Dave, did you see?" "I saw," he cut her off, his voice strained. "My home equity line is with them. My mortgage is with them." One by one, the circle of rejection called each other. Linda from Homestead Properties. The others. All of them, every single realtor who had politely shown Thomas the door, held a loan from the bank he now owned. It wasn't a coincidence. It was the town's financial ecosystem, and they were all trapped inside it. Thomas, meanwhile, was in the bank's records room. With his new authority, he had unfettered access. He started with the loan denial logs. He sorted by applicant name, then cross-referenced with census data by address. The pattern was so stark it was almost cartoonish. Over the past decade, the bank had received 43 mortgage applications from buyers with surnames common in predominantly black communities. 39 were denied. The 4 that were approved came with interest rates a full 2 points higher than the town average and required outsized down payments. He then pulled the files of the approved applicants. Notes in the margins in handwriting he recognized as Pratt's told the story. Cosigner from established Oak Bend family mitigates risk, or applicant is head nurse at county hospital, highly visible, low controversy. They were only allowed in if they were deemed safe, non-threatening, and vouched for by the existing order. But Thomas was looking for something specific. He requested the internal memos and the underwriting training manuals. Buried in a PDF from 2012 was a single, illuminating sentence. When evaluating properties in transitional neighborhoods or those with potential for demographic shift, apply enhanced scrutiny to ensure long-term value retention for the bank's portfolio. It was corporate speak for redlining. They weren't just judging individuals. They were policing neighborhoods, deciding who was worthy of building wealth here. Compiled the data into a damning, simple report. Denial rates, interest rate disparities, the memos. He had the how. Now he needed to understand the who had shaped this culture. He looked at the board minutes. Gerald Pratt was the executor, but the philosophy came from above. The board was a roster of Oak Bend's old guard, the founder's grandson, the retired judge, the largest commercial landlord, and one name appeared as chair of the loan committee for 15 years, Richard Dick Brenner. The man who owned half the commercial real estate on Main Street, including the building that housed Oak Bend Realty. Betty Carlisle's landlord. Thomas leaned back. It was a closed loop. Brenner's committee set loan policy that preserved the character of the town, which protected his property values. The realtors, dependent on Brenner for their leases and the bank for their own financing, enforced the policy with a smile and a shrug. They weren't just biased individuals. They were cogs in a perfectly engineered machine of exclusion. He decided his first move would not be a foreclosure. It would be a correction. He instructed the bank's attorney to draft a letter. It was addressed to Betty Carlisle, Dave, Linda, and the others. It stated that a review of their existing mortgage and home equity products had identified that they were potentially not aligned with current best rate offerings. The bank was offering a one-time opportunity to refinance at a significantly lower rate with no closing costs. The catch: they had to apply. They had to sit across from a loan officer, fill out the forms, and be approved asterisk. For Betty, receiving the letter was a fresh wave of nausea. It was a lifeline and a trap. To get the better rate, she had to submit to the very institution she now feared, run by the man she had wronged. Her financial future rested on his whim. The humiliation was exquisite. She called Dick Brenner. "Dick, this is out of control. This outsider is trying to bully us." Brenner's voice was gravelly calm. "I've seen the filing, Betty. The man bought the stock. It's legal. Pratt's a fool for letting the reserves get so low." "But what do we asterisk do? He has our mortgages." "He has a piece of paper saying he controls a board," Brenner corrected. "This is still a town. We have levers he doesn't understand. Let him play banker. We'll play community." Brenner's countermove began that afternoon. He called a meeting of the Oak Bend Business Alliance, a group he had founded and still chaired. The story was framed not as a takeover, but as an invasion. A disgruntled outsider, unable to buy his way in, had resorted to a hostile financial maneuver that threatened the stability of their asterisk bank. The town's bank. Rumors, carefully seeded, began to spread. Thomas was an opportunist. He was going to raise everyone's rates. He was going to call in loans to bankrupt people and buy up their property cheap. The narrative shifted from Thomas as a victim of discrimination to Thomas as a predatory threat. Thomas sensed the shift in the atmosphere. When he went to the local diner for coffee, conversations would stutter to a halt. People would look away. The friendly small-town veneer had hardened into a cold, unified front. He was no longer just a black man who wanted a house. He was a black man who had taken the keys to the kingdom, and the kingdom was mobilizing. Undeterred, he moved to step 2. He used his chairman's authority to unilaterally dissolve the old loan committee. He created a new one with himself as the head and appointed 2 trusted, newly hired compliance officers from outside the county. His first official act was to approve a loan that had been in limbo for months. It was for a young Latino family, the Garcias, who wanted to buy the old Miller place. They had been denied twice, with notes citing insufficient ties to the community. Thomas approved it at the prime rate. The sale went through. The Garcia family moved in. It was a single house, but in Oak Bend, it was a revolution. A for sale sign had been replaced by a sold sign for a family that didn't fit the old mold. The silent rule had been broken publicly and by the bank itself. This was the spark that lit the fuse. Dick Brenner could not let this stand. If Thomas could approve one such loan, he could approve dozens. The demographic dam would break. Brenner went to Gerald Pratt, who was now a figurehead, boiling with impotent rage. "He's dismantling everything, Gerald. Your legacy, the town's stability." "What would you have me do, Dick? He has the votes," Pratt spat. "You have the records," Brenner said softly, leaning in. "Not just the loan files, the operational records, the internal communications, the discretionary approvals." A dark understanding passed between them. Every bank has its skeletons. Discreet loans to board members' friends at sweetheart rates. Overlooked late payments for certain influential customers. The grease that makes the wheels of a small town turn. If Thomas kept digging past the discrimination patterns, he would find that too. He would find their asterisk fingerprints. "We can't let him have a free run of the archives," Brenner said. "A man like that, with a grudge, he wouldn't understand the nuances. He'd see corruption where there was just neighborly flexibility. He could ruin people." Pratt, seeing a chance to regain some semblance of control or at least inflict damage, agreed. Together, they formulated a plan. They would not attack Thomas directly. They would paint him as a danger, not to them but to the very people they claimed he wanted to help. Pratt drafted a confidential memo to the remaining, shell-shocked board members. It warned that Thomas Carter's, aggressive and racially charged, audit was likely to violate numerous customer privacy laws. It suggested that his true aim might be to publicly shame and expose individual town residents, holding their personal financial histories hostage to his agenda. He was not a reformer, the memo implied, but a radical with a vendetta, willing to burn the bank down to settle a personal score. The memo was leaked. It didn't go to the press. It was slipped anonymously into the mailboxes of every customer who had ever had a sensitive financial situation with the bank. The small business owner who'd gotten a hardship extension, the widow who'd briefly fallen behind, the family that had a short sale. The message was clear. Thomas Carter isn't just coming for the realtors. He's coming for you, asterisk. He has your secrets. The town's fear, once directed at Thomas for taking the bank, now transformed into a deeper, more personal terror. People started closing their accounts, not in a flood but in a steady, damaging trickle. The bank's already thin reserves began to strain. Thomas watched the withdrawal reports pile up on his desk. He wasn't facing a legal challenge or a boardroom coup. He was facing a silent, collective strike. Dick Brenner was playing the community lever perfectly, turning Thomas's own power against him. The bank could be legally his, but if it was empty, it was just a building. Sitting in the chairman's office late that night, Thomas stared at the numbers. He had won the battle of ownership, but he was losing the war for the bank's survival. And then his phone buzzed. It was an encrypted message from his financial advisor in the city. It contained a single line, running trace on unusual trading activity in OBRT stock last 48 hours. Stand by. Someone was making a new move. The financial chessboard, which Thomas thought he controlled, had another player, and the pieces were shifting in the dark. The trace came back in under an hour. While Thomas had been fighting a public relations war on Main Street, a silent financial assault had begun. A shell corporation registered in Delaware, with layers of ownership too complex to immediately unravel, had been aggressively buying up every available share of Oak Bend regional stock on the secondary market. They weren't trying to take control from Thomas. They didn't have enough for that. They were trying to spike the price, to make it look like the bank was suddenly a hot commodity. This was a classic pump and dump precursor, but with a more sinister twist. By artificially inflating the value, they could trigger regulatory scrutiny. If the stock price swung wildly based on suspicious trading, the Securities and Exchange Commission could freeze all controlling actions, potentially even suspend Thomas's voting rights pending an investigation. It was a weaponization of the very market mechanisms he'd used. Thomas's advisor identified the capital source. It funneled back through a series of holding companies to a primary investment vehicle owned by none other than Richard Brenner. The old guard wasn't just leaking memos. They were playing high-stakes financial warfare. Brenner was burning his own money to create a smokescreen of chaos, hoping a regulator would step in and take the bank away from both of them, just to restore order. But the stock manipulation was only the first move. The second arrived by certified mail, a notice from the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. A routine examination had been moved up, citing potential instability due to recent change in control and observed deposit outflows. The examination was scheduled for the following week. If the FDIC found the bank was undercapitalized or operating unsafely, they could place it into receivership. All of Thomas's power, all his shares, would be meaningless. The government would take over, clean up the books, and sell the remains. Brenner and Pratt would be ruined too, but they were betting Thomas had more to lose. It was a scorched earth strategy. Thomas faced a triage situation. The bank run was draining liquidity. The stock manipulation threatened his legal authority. The FDIC audit could end the game entirely. He needed to stabilize the institution immediately. That meant stopping the withdrawals, and that meant he had to address the town's fear directly. He didn't issue a press release. He walked down to the Oak Bend Weekly newspaper, a small office above the hardware store, and asked to speak to the editor, an earnest woman in her 60s named Marjorie. He laid it out plainly, showing her the FDIC notice, the data on the discriminatory loan patterns, and the records of the suspicious stock trades linked to Brenner's companies. "They're trying to sink the bank to sink me," he told her. "If they succeed, the FDIC comes in. Maybe another bank buys the assets. More likely, loans get called, lines of credit dry up, and this town's economy goes into a deep freeze. The people they're scaring are the ones who will get hurt the most." Marjorie, who had known Brenner for 40 years and had always found him a bit too slick, listened. She published the story the next day. It was not an opinion piece. It was a straightforward report. Local bank faces regulatory scrutiny amid ownership dispute. Financial data shows racial disparities in lending. It named Brenner's investment vehicle as the source of the unusual trading. For the first time, the town saw the battle not as outsider versus us, but as a power struggle between two forces, with their savings as the collateral. The effect was not immediate forgiveness for Thomas, but it broke the spell of unified silence. People started asking questions. At the diner, instead of hushed tones, there were heated debates. Is Brenner really trying to crash the bank? Did you see those loan numbers? The narrative splintered. Taking advantage of the crack in the facade, Thomas made his boldest move yet. He stood on the steps of the bank with a microphone. A small, curious crowd gathered, filmed by Marjorie's reporter. "My name is Thomas Carter. I own this bank," he began, no aggression, just weary fact. Some of you have been told I'm here to hurt you, to call your loans. The opposite is true. The people who told you those stories are the same ones whose names are on the documents that denied loans to families like the Garcias for the last 10 years. They are also the ones currently manipulating the stock price, which has triggered a federal audit that now threatens every account here. He held up a single sheet. This is a binding directive from the chair. For the next 90 days, there will be no foreclosures initiated by Oak Bend Regional. None. For any reason. Furthermore, any customer who has withdrawn funds in the last 2 weeks due to concerns can redeposit them with a guaranteed 1% interest bonus for the quarter. It was a massive, costly promise, but it was peace offering and shield in one. The crowd murmured. It was a tangible financial benefit that addressed their core fear, losing their homes. The bleeding of deposits slowed to a trickle, then reversed slightly. He had stabilized the patient. But Brenner was not finished. The financial warfare had failed. The fear campaign was fraying. So he moved to the final, most personal front, the law. Through his contacts, he prompted the county prosecutor to take a fresh look at Thomas's acquisition. Were all the shell corporations used in the initial stock purchases properly disclosed? Could this be construed as a scheme to gain control through deceptive means? A criminal investigation, even a baseless one, would be a cloud that could scare away any future business, any potential partners Thomas might need to truly fix the bank. Thomas received the call from a nervous county investigator. They wanted to schedule an interview. It was a fishing expedition, but he knew how these things worked. Accusations got printed. Reputations got stained. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts. That night, Thomas went back to the one thing he had neglected in his fight for control, the original offense, the land. He drove out to the 10-acre parcel with the barn, the first property Betty Carlisle had dangled and snatched away. The sold sign was still up, but the house was dark. No cars. He checked the county property portal. The sale had never been recorded. The local family that beat his offer didn't exist. It had been a lie to keep him out. The property was still owned by the same reclusive trust. He dug deeper into that trust. Its beneficiary was a charitable foundation. The chairman of that foundation's board was Richard Brenner. Brenner didn't just influence the town. He controlled key parcels of its land, keeping them off the market to maintain scarcity and control. Thomas wasn't just fighting a man. He was fighting a system where one person was the zoning board, the bank, the landlord, and the real estate market. Armed with this, Thomas requested a private meeting. Not at the bank, not at Brenner's office. On neutral ground, the empty lot beside the old property. They met at dusk, two silhouettes against a darkening sky. "You've made your point, Carter," Brenner said, dispensing with pleasantries. "You're a tough man to get rid of, but this investigation will grind you down. You'll spend more on lawyers than you made in the Army. Walk away. Sell your shares back to the board at a premium. Take your profit and leave this town to its peace." Thomas looked at the land, then back at Brenner. This was never about profit. It was about the principle. You told me, through your realtors and your bank, that I didn't belong here, that my kind didn't belong here. This isn't personal, it's business. It's about protecting value. "It's always personal," Thomas said quietly. Then he presented his new discovery. "You own this land through your foundation. You blocked the sale to me not to sell to a local family, but to keep me out. That's not business. That's a fraudulent real estate practice. Coupled with your stock manipulation, that's a pattern. The SEC and the state attorney general might find that very interesting." For the first time, Thomas saw a flicker of real concern in Brenner's eyes. He had moved the battle from Thomas's turf to Brenner's. He was no longer defending his acquisition. He was prosecuting Brenner's corruption. "What do you want?" Brenner asked, his voice tight. "I want 3 things," Thomas said. 1, you dissolve your shell company and end all stock trading. 2, you call off the county prosecutor. You have the pull. 3, you sell this parcel to me at fair market value today." Brenner laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Or what, you'll sue me? That'll take years. No, Thomas said, shaking his head. I'll file a complaint with the FDIC tomorrow, detailing how a major depositor and former board chair is actively destabilizing the bank. With the audit already pending, they will immediately freeze every asset you have tied to this institution. Every business loan, every line of credit. Your developments on the edge of town, frozen. Your Main Street remodels, stopped. You'll be bankrupt before our lawsuit gets a hearing date. It was checkmate. Brenner had used the bank as a weapon. Thomas was now using it as a shield. He had turned the institution's regulatory vulnerability against its architect. Brenner was silent for a long minute, staring at the land he controlled but could no longer protect. You'll destroy the bank doing that, he finally muttered. Maybe, Thomas conceded, but you'll be buried under it. I walked onto a battlefield when I came here. I'm prepared to burn it down. Are you? The standoff stretched out in the fading light. Brenner, the king of Oak Bend, faced the veteran who had turned his own kingdom into the battlefield. Thomas had the leverage, but using it was mutually assured destruction. The next move would determine whether there would be a bank or a town left for anyone to control. Richard Brenner did not sleep that night. The veteran's ultimatum had turned his own fortress against him. At dawn, his lawyer delivered the signed agreement to Thomas Carter's temporary office at the bank. The terms were met. The shell company was dissolved. The mysterious stock trade ceased. A call was made to the county prosecutor, and the tentative investigation into Thomas's acquisition was quietly labeled unfounded and closed. And the 10-acre parcel with the barn was transferred to a holding company owned by Thomas at a fair price. The war was over. Brenner surrendered, not to save the town, but to save his own empire from the regulatory avalanche Thomas promised. The FDIC examiners arrived the following Monday. The atmosphere in the bank was tense but orderly. Thomas provided full transparency. He showed them the discriminatory loan data, his corrective directives, and the now stable deposit reports. He also disclosed the attempted stock manipulation by Brenner, presenting the signed settlement as evidence of its resolution. The examiner's final report was a mixed verdict. They cited significant historical deficiencies in fair lending practices, but noted aggressive and appropriate corrective action under new control. They did not place the bank into receivership. Instead, they mandated a 3-year supervisory period with quarterly reporting. The bank would live, with Thomas at the helm, under watchful eyes. With the immediate threats neutralized, Thomas began the real work of rebuilding. His first official act as uncontested chairman was to fire Gerald Pratt. There was no ceremony. A security escort walked the former president out of the building he'd ruled for decades. Thomas then appointed an interim president, Elena Martinez, a sharp, no-nonsense banking compliance expert he recruited from a regional Federal Reserve office. Her mandate was clear: scrub the policies, retrain the staff, and rebuild the bank's reputation on the principle of equitable access. The changes were visceral. The old loan committee was permanently abolished. New algorithms for loan approvals, blind to zip code and surname, were installed. The bank launched a first-time homebuyer program specifically targeted at communities of color and low to moderate income families in the county, with reduced down payments and financial literacy workshops. Thomas personally approved the first loan under this program to the Garcia family, to refinance their existing mortgage at the prime rate, saving them hundreds a month. For the realtors who had rejected him, the consequences were financial and profound. Betty Carlisle, Dave, and the others did apply to refinance their mortgages with the bank, as offered. Their applications were processed by the new blind system. They were all approved, but at rates that were fair, not preferential. The special town insider discounts they had enjoyed for years were gone. Their monthly payments went up. The financial pinch was a constant, quiet reminder of the new order. But Thomas went further. He used the bank's influence as a major commercial lender to enact change on Main Street. When Dick Brenner's property management company came up for loan renewal on several of its buildings, including the one housing Oak Bend Realty. The bank approved it, but with a new covenant. The leases in those properties had to include a non-discrimination clause that went beyond the Federal Fair Housing Act, explicitly prohibiting refusal to rent or sell based on source of income, which protected veterans using VA benefits, and requiring implicit bias training for all tenant realtors. Brenner, his economic power now checked by the bank, had no choice but to agree. The town itself began a slow, uneasy transformation. The sold sign on the Garcia family's home was joined by others. A black family from the city bought the old Johnson farm. A young Asian American couple opened a veterinary clinic in a storefront on Main Street. The dam had broken. Oak Bend was not becoming a different town. It was finally becoming the town it had always claimed to be on its welcome sign, a community for all. Thomas finally began building his home on the 10-acre parcel. He hired a construction crew from the next county over, a diverse team that became a familiar sight. He often worked alongside them, his military-issue boots dusty, his hands back in the honest work of creation rather than destruction. The barn was restored. The house, a modern, elegant structure with a wide porch, rose from the land he was once told he could never own. One afternoon, about a year after the takeover, a visitor came to the construction site. It was Betty Carlisle. She looked older, stripped of her cheerful veneer. She stood at the edge of the property, not daring to come closer until Thomas saw her and waved her over. I don't know, she started, her voice small. To say I'm sorry doesn't cover it. Thomas put down his hammer. What you did wasn't just to me, Betty. It was to every family you turned away based on what they looked like. Your apology needs to go to them. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I'm selling the business, retiring, I can't. I don't belong in that world anymore. What will you do? He asked. I don't know. She looked out at the rising house. It's a beautiful place you're building. It is, Thomas said. After a moment, he added, the bank's new community advisory board meets next month. We need people who understand the history of this town, even the ugly parts, to help guide its future. It's unpaid. It's hard work. If you're serious about change, consider applying. It was an offer of redemption she never expected. Not forgiveness, but a chance to contribute to the repair. She left without another word, the weight of the offer hanging in the air. The final surprising detail emerged not from a battle, but from a routine audit of the bank's oldest safe deposit boxes. One box, rented since 1978 and paid automatically from a trust, had been abandoned by any living claimant. After following legal procedure, the box was drilled open. It did not contain jewels or cash. It held a single, yellowed envelope. Inside was the original 1947 deed to a plot of land on the outskirts of Oak Bend, and a faded photograph of a black couple standing proudly in front of a small, neat house. A notarized letter explained that the couple, Abraham and Flora Carter, had purchased the land with their savings after Abraham returned from the war in the Pacific. They had been forced out 6 months later by a fire sale initiated after the local bank, the predecessor to Oak Bend Regional, called a sudden, dubious balloon payment on their construction loan. The land was then bought by a developer for pennies. The developer's name was the grandfather of Richard Brenner. Thomas Carter held the photograph of his great-grandparents, standing on land that was stolen from them through financial chicanery, a generation before redlining had a name. His fight was not the beginning of the story. It was the closing of a circle. The bank that had been used as a weapon to steal his family's legacy had now been captured and turned into an instrument of restoration. At the next shareholder meeting, now attended by new, diverse investors from the community, Thomas announced the creation of the Carter Family Legacy Fund. It would use a portion of the bank's profits to provide down payment assistance to descendants of families who could prove they were victims of historical housing discrimination in the county. The first grant was posthumously awarded to the estate of Abraham and Flora Carter. Thomas used it to purchase a small memorial plaque, placed not on his new property, but in the town square, telling their story and the story of the bank's transformation. Oak Bend Regional Bank and Trust, under its new name, First Oak Community Bank, became a statewide model for equitable lending. The story of the veteran who bought the bank to beat discrimination was written up in national papers, not as a revenge fantasy, but as a case study in using capitalism to force moral accountability. Thomas Carter, sitting on his porch overlooking the creek, finally found the quiet he had originally sought. But it was not the quiet of exclusion. It was the quiet of hard-won peace, of justice served not with a shout but with the steady, irrevocable force of a signed contract, a fair loan, and a door held open for the next person who came looking for a home. The battle for Oak Bend was over. The work of building a better town had just begun. The story of Oak Bend is not unique, only its resolution. For decades, in thousands of communities across America, the quiet machinery of exclusion has operated through smiles and paperwork, through zoning boards and loan committees. What Thomas Carter achieved was not just personal justice, it was a demonstration of a profound, often overlooked truth. In a system built on capital, capital itself can become the most disruptive tool for change. He didn't protest outside the bank, he bought the boardroom. He didn't ask for a seat at the table, he owned the table and reset the place settings. His victory was specific, hard-won, and replicable in principle, if not in dramatic scale. It exposes the pressure points. It shows that the levers of exclusion, mortgages, appraisals, zoning, and lending are not forces of nature. They are human systems built and maintained by people who can be held accountable legally and financially. The data Thomas uncovered, the patterns of denial based on zip code and surname, those exist in bank archives everywhere. The challenge is finding the will, the resources, and the cunning to go and look. This is the lingering question the Oak Bend story leaves us with. We celebrate the veteran who turned the tables, but what about the millions who never could? What about those without a seven-figure portfolio to convert into leverage? Thomas Carter's story is a satisfying fantasy of one man balancing the scales, but the systemic imbalance remains. It is woven into the very fabric of American wealth, a gap where the white homeownership rate still towers nearly 30 points above the black homeownership rate, a direct legacy of the same policies Oak Bend enforced. So the real takeaway isn't that everyone should go buy a bank. It's that the tools of exclusion are financial, and therefore they are vulnerable. They can be audited. They can be litigated. They can be reformed by policy and exposed by journalism. Thomas used a sledgehammer. The work for most will be done with scalpels and spreadsheets, with fair housing complaints and persistent investigation. But the objective is the same: to transform institutions from gatekeepers of exclusion into engines of access. The plaque in the Oak Bend town square, bearing the names of Abraham and Flora Carter, marks more than a corrected injustice. It is a receipt, a public ledger entry proving that a debt, however old, was finally acknowledged. It asks every person who passes it a simple, uncomfortable question: what other debts are still outstanding in your town? If you found this story of a quiet, calculated justice compelling, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, we delve into another tale where the underdog didn't just fight the system but reverse-engineered it. I'll see you there.